Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day. Today, we talk with Council on Foreign Relations fellow Liana Fix about the upcoming German elections and the rise of the right-wing Alternative for Germany. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the biggest foreign policy issues happening in the past few weeks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
So, Freddie, what are we going to talk about today?
So, Kelly, good morning. First, we're going to talk about last week's release of a new Chinese open source AI model that has sent a scare into the US tech industry. Then we're going to dive into the recent fall of a major city in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to a group of rebels. And we're going to give an update on South Korea's presidential crisis. Finally, we'll turn to our conversation with Liana Fix about recent political and economic turmoil in Germany. So to get us started with China's new open source AI model, last week there were ripples in stock markets around the world as DeepSeek, a Chinese AI startup, released its competitor to OpenAI's ChatGPT. DeepSeek's large language model quickly became the #1 app on the App Store. It is a free open source model that has matched OpenAI's in some third-party tests. On the first day of trading after the model's release, the market value of NVIDIA, the US's AI bellwether, fell about 17%, and the US tech industry as a whole lost about $1 trillion in market cap value. DeepSeek claims its latest model will cost under $6 million to train and uses far less computing power than Western models. The low figure does not include the costs of prior research or hardware, which may still be significant. But in any case, the budget appears to be far below that of ChatGPT-4, OpenAI's latest model, which cost about $100 million to train. Even more impressively, the model uses reduced capability NVIDIA chips due to American export controls on more powerful semiconductor technologies, meaning that DeepSeek has produced a comparable model with significantly worse hardware than their American competitors. Kelly, we've seen stocks rebound quite a bit after the initial drop. So how worried should the US tech industry really be about this competition? And what will or can the Trump administration do about it?
So I think those are still open questions, but I do think one of the important things to keep in mind here is that this did send pretty large shockwaves through not only financial markets, but through, government groups as well. And the tech world, basically anybody that, keeps an eye on AI or is working on it or anything like that. So there's a few reasons for that, and we'll dive into those a little bit. So the first thing to keep in mind is that over the past few years, this growing competition over AI between the US and China has really taken center stage. And we've seen the Biden administration really try to build out AI domestically, and the plants that build the chips for the AI models to run on and increase power sources outlaid a lot of money towards this because of the dollars that were being spent in training the AI were really high numbers. Then on the second side of this, the Biden administration was also curbing the export of chips from the US and from allies and partners to create these really high-end chips to try to close the Chinese out of this technology so that they couldn't keep pace with or catch up to the US on AI. So that's part of this. The second part about this is you mentioned the expense behind AI. So we've been spending billions of dollars in the United States on AI with the thought process that we're going to have to dump tons and tons of money into this to train up AI, build the data centers, build all this kind of stuff, create and buy more and more chips and everything, where the Chinese, if accurate, looks like they've spent a fraction of the cost to build their AI, which is almost as good as the leading edge AI in the United States. So, that threw people for a loop. Not only the fact that they could create this AI that was as close to the American versions while having this lockdown on access to chips, and then, basically creating sort of a homegrown AI supply chain, but then also doing it at a fraction of the cost has really sort of freaked a lot of people out in the US, to put it bluntly. But long term, though, it remains to be seen sort of how this is going to shake out. Like, what does this mean for what's being done in the US and what we're spending? It doesn't seem to have slowed down the way forward for what US tech companies are thinking about what they need to do to build out AI in the future. So, this is something we're going to have to watch, and I don't think it's going to get answered in the near term. I think there's going to be potentially different pathways to get to the type of AI you want to get to, and we'll see what can be integrated and what can't be integrated. But it was a big moment on a number of levels because of the cost of this, plus seeing what China was able to do without access to these NVIDIA chips. And yeah, we're just going to have to watch this moving forward and see what the next iterations of DeepSeek look like, what are the next iterations of ChatGPT look like, and who's making the major leaps going forward. As for President Trump, he said that DeepSeek should be a wake-up call to these tech companies in the US that need to be laser focused on competing to win. And he also said that this faster method of AI and the lesser expense of it could be a positive thing. So we're going to have to wait and see if Trump doubles down on a lot of these export controls to try to prevent Chinese AI growth even further. But that's an area to kind of watch in the coming weeks on what is going to be the US government reaction to this vis-a-vis China.
So, moving on to our next story, there has been fierce fighting in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where government forces have been battling M23 rebels backed by Rwanda, the DRC's smaller neighbor to the east. Last week, M23 fighters captured Goma, the largest city in the eastern part of the country that sits right on the border with Rwanda. In the last month, at least 100 people, including 17 UN peacekeepers, have been killed and over 1,000 wounded as civilians have been caught in the crossfire. And the UN has reported that there are over 7.2 million internally displaced persons. Just this morning, on Tuesday, February 4th, the rebel groups declared a unilateral ceasefire, calling off their advances to nearby cities. Their statement insisted that this was a humanitarian ceasefire and that they would hold their current positions. So, Kelly, where did this conflict and this rebel group M23 come from?
Yeah, so I think we need to start a few decades ago, actually. I think there's a number of things to keep in mind when you're thinking about M23, the DRC, and Rwanda and what's going on here. Like a number of these conflicts right now that are going on in Africa, it can be very convoluted and there's multiple groups and cross-border actions and things like that going on. So, as you mentioned, Rwanda has a major role to play in this. And Rwanda is a small country that is to the east of the DRC. And it's had a long history of sending troops across the border into the DRC. So, obviously, Rwanda is most well known for the 1994 genocide, where nearly 2 million ethnic Hutus fled to the DRC, and some of them formed armed militia groups. And then Rwanda was invading in 1996 and 1998 into the DRC under the pretext of protecting ethnic Tutsis who were targeted by the Hutu extremists during the genocide. So that's where it starts to get a little convoluted. In the early 2000s, a Tutsi dominated rebel group called the March 23rd Movement, or M23, as they're known now, formed in the DRC, and they formed as a force for Tutsi rights under the pretense that the DRC was targeting Congolese Tutsis and seeking to destabilize the Tutsi majority government of Rwanda. Now, remember, these ethnic groups move beyond borders and their historical areas don't naturally align a lot of times with nation state borders. So there's Tutsis in the DRC, there's Tutsis in Rwanda. So that, helps to muddy the waters on what's going on here. So, like with some of the other wars going on in Africa right now, there are concerns that this could draw in more countries. There was a war in the Congo from 1998 to 2003 that was sometimes called Africa's World War. And that was the deadliest conflict in the world since World War II. That conflict dragged in 9 African nations and 25 armed groups and directly killed around 350,000 people. So there's worries about that, which again makes the just announced ceasefire all the more important. And we'll see how long that lasts and if they can make it last. Another dimension to this, there's always money and finances involved in some form or another. But another dimension of this conflict is the massive mineral deposits of cobalt, copper, and coltan used in laptops and smartphones and highly coveted in today's technological world. These critical minerals have further incentivized the spread of armed groups The UN has accused M23 of funneling coltan and gold from the eastern DRC into Rwanda. And the UN stated that they are potentially making up to $800,000 a month from the trade of coltan alone. So, as they move in and take over these DRC mines, which are owned by Chinese companies, which then brings China into this because they're supplying drones and weapons to the Congolese government to fight the rebel groups. So there's multiple players involved in here. There's critical minerals and access to the critical minerals, in part what some of these groups are after. It's a very muddy situation. It's also important to remember that there are already UN peacekeepers on the ground in this region, but they're actually getting shot at. As you noted, 17 of them have been killed. The UN mission in the DRC has been slowly withdrawing from the country since 2023, which isn't helping the situation. And on the flip side, M23's seizure of Goma demonstrates as well how weak the DRC's government forces are in some areas of the country. Ultimately, it's good news that there was a ceasefire announced, and we don't really know at this point a lot of details about it, whether it's a temporary, permanent ceasefire. Rebels still control Goma. There's thousands and thousands of displaced people within the region and the area. And, we'll have to see if this was just a pause to let in aid and medical supplies, or if they can work something out more long term. But any ceasefire, even if it's for a short time, is good so that the different groups can come in and try to work something out. But this is definitely something that we need to keep an eye on moving forward because, as we've seen in the past, this area and this region has a history of sparking larger wars and very deadly wars.
Moving to our next story, South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol became the country's first leader to be indicted for insurrection charges after he declared martial law back in December. Yoon now faces two separate court cases, one for corruption charges and the other for inciting an insurrection. This follows a particularly dramatic couple of months in South Korean politics. Last month, President Yoon was detained and has been held in jail after a tense standoff between his presidential guard and the national police. After his arrest warrant was extended, Yoon's supporters charged the court building where he was held, attacking and injuring 17 police officers. Kelly, what led to this moment, and what can we expect from South Korean politics moving forward?
So, yeah, the news out of South Korea over the past few weeks has been pretty crazy, to say the least. And I just want to underline how serious this insurrection case is. If he is convicted of charges of inciting a rebellion, Yoon could face life in jail or even the death penalty. So it's very serious, not just for democracy itself, but for Yoon personally. So during the brief period that there was martial law, Yoon and his supporters in the right wing People's Power Party claimed that military rule was necessary to save South Korea from North Korean communists and the liberal controlled National Assembly, as they saw it. So the declaration of martial law only lasted about 6 hours, but it was a reminder of military rule that had dominated South Korea until the 1980s. And this is what sparked a massive popular backlash against Yoon. The protesters themselves helped lawmakers enter the assembly building to reverse the declaration of martial law. And prior to his impeachment, polls showed that about three-quarters of South Koreans wanted Yoon out of office anyways. So this was kind of coming to a head politically before Yoon had declared martial law. The population has shown a great deal of resilience and interest in preserving South Korean democracy, thankfully, with the seizure of power being opposed by lawmakers, journalists, and especially ordinary citizens who protested in large numbers. The political period for the moment remains very uncertain, though. The leader of the left-wing Democratic Party faces multiple indictments in relation to corruption and bribery cases himself. And the country also remains divided in other key ways. Yoon's right-wing party has enjoyed a lot of support among young men, many of whom have been radicalized by YouTube echo chambers of disinformation. This is particularly troubling in a country that was, up until 1987, a military dictatorship. So, this is something that they're going to need to work through. And, we hope that Yoon's declaration of martial law is not a dangerous, foreboding sign that presidents feel emboldened to take absolute power and are supported by, just a minority, even though it's a vocal minority, because that doesn't bode well for democracy writ large. So, moving forward, what I'm going to be watching for is how lawmakers in Yoon's party prioritize their loyalty to him compared to institutional principles that underlie South Korea's democracy. So, you can make that statement in a number of democracies around the world today, but we're going to have to watch and see how the rest of his party handles this moving forward, whether or not they back the party leader or democracy itself in South Korea. So that ends our news roundup. And we now move to our conversation on Germany with Liana Fix, a fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations. Liana is a historian and political scientist with expertise in German and European foreign and security policy, European security, transatlantic relations, Russia, Eastern Europe, and European China policy. She is also an adjunct faculty member at Georgetown University in the Center for German and European Studies and the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. Her recent book, A New German Power: Germany's Role in European Russia Policy, was published in 2021 by Palgrave Macmillan. Let's listen in to the conversation. All right, welcome back, everybody. And I'm excited to be joined today by Liana Fix, who's going to talk to us about what exactly is going on in Germany these days. Liana, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
So let's just start off with some basics. Germany, as many of our listeners know, has long sort of been Europe's economic powerhouse, but that's kind of hit a snag in the last couple years. What's going on with the German economy right now, and how is that causing some of these challenges that Germany's facing right now?
Yeah, so the German economy is really in a bad shape. It has been basically flatlining since 2018, 2019. It has been shrinking the last 2 years. And in comparison to the other EU countries, it is among the lowest growing countries, which is unusual for Germany. The popular explanations for that are the COVID pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the energy shock, and the energy prices to Germany, which is all true. But why then is it hitting Germany so particularly hard in comparison to other European countries? And I would argue that the reason for that is not only Russia, the pandemic, but it is the China problem for Germany. Germany had an export-led growth model. China was the growth engine for the German economy. But now Germany, who has been the export Weltmeister, the export world champion for a long time, has been overtaken by China as the export world champion. China has reduced its imports massively, has increased its exports massively, which means for German producers that they can't export as much as they want to China. And at the same time, Chinese products, including high-tech products, are competing with German products, not only in Europe, but also in third markets. And that is the long-term reason why Germany's economy is not growing, because the growth market, China, is not there anymore.
Interesting. And this has had a political effect as well. In November, the Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, fired his finance minister, and this caused the collapse of what had been a three-party coalition that was running Germany. And that means that they're going to have an election later this month on February 23rd. So what role did Scholz play in this collapse, or was it kind of out of his hands? And, why did this happen now, basically?
Yeah, so this was the first post-Merkel government, the first attempt to form a government after the 16 years of the Merkel era. And it was for many Germans a hopeful attempt because they felt 16 years of Merkel have led to stagnation. We need reforms, domestic reforms, economic reforms. And this coalition has embarked on a set of reforms, but then reality hit, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and suddenly the room for maneuver that the government thought they have, especially in terms of their budget, was shrinking. So all the pet projects that these three parties, the Greens, the Liberals, the Social Democrats, were planning for their own constituencies were suddenly at danger. And this coalition turned, instead of working with each other, to an opposition coalition where every party was working against each other out of fear that they would lose popularity with their own constituencies. And that's a greater challenge in the German political system, that with the rise of left-wing and right-wing populist parties, you suddenly need three parties to form a governing coalition. And those three parties are often not ideologically cohesive. But the step for early elections is still a big step for Germany. Germany is not France, where you could call early elections almost every couple of years. Because of Germany's history, especially the Weimar Republic, the interwar attempt at democracy in Germany between the First and the Second World War was a republic that failed, amongst others, because it had elections over and over again. The parliament was dissolved over and over again. So the German constitution actually does not foresee the dissolution of the German parliament. So it is a big bang event that this is taking place. And the election debate is as polarized as it hasn't been in decades also, because just in the last week, the firewall debate about how to deal with the alternative for Germany has been opened up by the conservatives again.
Yeah, and you mentioned Merkel and political stability for, a decade and a half or so in Germany. And you also just mentioned the alternative for Germany, the AfD party. So we now have seeming instability in German politics. Plus, we have the rise of the AfD, the far right. So can you give us a quick rundown of the history of that party and why do they seem to be having success now?
Yeah, so the AfD was originally founded as an anti-Euro party, basically looking at the UK, looking at Brexit, the discontent with the European Union. So it was a party that wanted to return the Deutschmark, the German currency. That party has been slowly taken over by right-wing populists, and all those original founding members, Bernd Lucke and others who were focused on the economy, have slowly disappeared. And since then, we see a process of the alternative for Germany that has gained a huge boost with the migration crisis in 2015, when Merkel said, no, I'm not going to close the border. This party has really radicalized over the last 10 years to an extent that few other European right-wing parties have done. Most European right-wing parties are trying to moderate themselves, at least in their public appearances, to become more governable, more able to govern. The AfD is embarking on exactly the different path and is under observation of Germany's domestic intelligence in multiple regions of Germany. So this party has gained in popularity with the migration crisis, but it has particularly gained in popularity during the last 3 years of this three-party coalition government. It had its first boost with Angela Merkel in the migration crisis, and the second boost, which brought them to 20% of the vote in opinion polls now, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the energy shock, but also the chaotic government and policy proposals of the three-party coalition, which have led to a lot of uncertainty. Let's say the popular example is reforming the German heating system and forcing homeowners who need to repair the old heating system to install heat pumps, which became a hugely unpopular issue in Germany that was exploited by the AfD. And now, with rising asylum numbers, with terrorist attacks in Germany, the AfD, and of course with Elon Musk suddenly supporting the AfD and finding a soft spot for that party, the AfD is really riding a wave.
So you just mentioned Elon Musk, and I wanted to talk to you about that. He has, of course, waded into not only British politics, but now German politics, and even visited an AfD rally in which he denounced a focus on past guilt, obviously referring to the Holocaust and World War II. What are the Germans making of this intervention by an outsider, by a foreigner, into their politics?
Yeah, so many Germans did really not like it. They don't like to be lectured by Elon Musk about their own history. Obviously, Elon Musk did not get many things right about the AfD and their potential for Germany. What is more frustrating or has been more annoying to Germans, even that he has further doubled down or tripled down on his initial outreach to the AfD. So he doesn't seem to be convincible that this was the wrong path to go, as initially German conservatives and German startup leaders thought. So it was a big public debate. There was a lot of annoyed voices about how does he dare to do this? To what extent is he speaking on behalf of Donald Trump? But in the end, I think we should not overstate the actual impact that had, because Elon Musk is by now not particularly popular, even though he runs a huge Tesla factory close to Berlin with a lot of important jobs for that area. But his role in politics is seen very skeptically by Germans. So what has probably given a greater triumph to the AfD than the support of the richest man on earth has been that the conservatives have voted in the Bundestag together with the AfD, accepting votes of the AfD on an asylum motion last week. That has been for the AfD really one of the long-term goals, that they had to raise the firewall in German politics against the AfD.
Okay, so looking ahead at the election, how do you see this sort of shaking out? And we've mentioned the AfD, but who are the other major players in this as we get into the election here?
Yeah, so the CDU is at 30% in elections, Friedrich Merz, the Conservative Party. The AfD is the second strongest party, and for the CDU, it will be incredibly important to win the elections with a major distance to the AfD. If they're close to each other, that will demonstrate that the conservatives have lost the monopoly on the center-right in Germany. So having a lot of distance to the AfD is incredibly important also to keep the firewall alive, if you want to keep it alive. And then we have the Social Democrats and the Greens. The Social Democrats are at 15%, the Greens at around 12 or 13%. So the most realistic outcome, and perhaps the best case scenario for Germany as an outcome of these elections, is a two-party coalition, which seems most likely between the Conservatives and the Social Democrats. That's a coalition that we already had 2 times under Angela Merkel, which was not particularly popular because it was always a coalition for the lowest common denominator. But right now, any experiment with another 3-party coalition would probably be another unstable experiment for Germany. So that would be the best outcome, 2-party coalitions. And the other options are 3-party coalitions. The worst option that could emerge is a minority government if Friedrich Merz conservatives are not able to agree with center-left parties, the Social Democrats or the Greens, for example, on migration policy. He might be tempted to say, well, then I'm governing from a minority position, and then he might be tempted to accept votes from the AfD in shifting coalitions, which would really be breaking a taboo in German politics.
So looking forward then, if we're going to have a new chancellor, how do you see this affecting not only Germany's politics within and relations within Europe, but with the second Trump administration?
Yeah, so with a likely Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and ironically, he was once the arch enemy of Angela Merkel, right? I mean, Angela Merkel has sidelined him and elbowed him out of politics on her way to the top, and now he is trying to remake German politics against the legacy of Angela Merkel. But ironically, he could be the right man at the right time. There's often criticism that in his political views, he seems outdated, especially the younger generation says, well, he seems like directly from the 80s. But in times like these, especially in foreign and security policy, being from the 80s with a kind of Cold War mentality on security defense might not be the worst thing to have. So he has given a foreign policy speech in Berlin a couple of weeks ago where he outlined that he wants to renew Germany's relations with Poland and France, which are in really bad shape right now, that he wants to move Germany from a sleeping middle power to a leading middle power. He personally, as a self-made businessman, could get along well with Donald Trump. Also, what unites the two of them is certainly their lack of sympathy for Angela Merkel. And on the international stage, Friedrich Merz very clearly understands what the challenges for Germany's security are, coming both from Russia as well as from China. So we might see a rather unexpected comeback of Germany on the international stage if Friedrich Merz fulfills the ambitions that he has outlined.
All right, we will all be watching on February 23rd to see how this all shakes out. Liana, thank you so much for joining us and getting us a little bit smarter on Germany.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Thanks again to Liana for her time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines and History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.